On June 24, 1943, in a small English village, black American soldiers and white military police faced off in a confrontation that would leave one man dead and expose the stark contradiction at the heart of the war for democracy. But what makes this story truly extraordinary is who stood alongside those black soldiers when the shooting started. Picture a warm summer evening in Lancashire, England. The pubs are filling up as the workday ends. American soldiers, fresh from their duties at the nearby air base, are mixing with locals over pints of bitter. Laughter carries through the open windows. Someone's teaching an English girl how to do the jitterbug. It's a scene that could be from any village hosting Allied troops in the summer of 1943, except for one crucial detail that would soon make this night unforgettable. The village of Bamber Bridge sits just south of Preston in Lancashire, England. Population in 1943, around 6,800 people. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the same families have run the same shops for generations, where the biggest excitement is usually the Saturday market or the occasional dance at the village hall. Most of them had never met a black person before early 1943. That changed when the U.S. military's 1511 Quartermaster Truck Regiment arrived at Air Force Station 569, nicknamed Adam Hall, on Mounsey Road. The men who stepped off those trucks and into the Lancashire countryside were, for the most part, from the American South. They'd grown up knowing exactly where they could and couldn't go, what they could and couldn't do, who they could and couldn't talk to. The rules were unwritten but absolute. Break them, and you might end up beaten, arrested, or worse. This was the world of Jim Crow, and it had shaped every day of their lives since birth. The 1511th was a logistics unit. Their job was simple but essential: deliver supplies to other 8th Air Force bases scattered across Lancashire. They drove trucks loaded with everything an airfield needs to function: ammunition, fuel, food, spare parts, medical supplies. Every bomber that took off to strike at occupied Europe depended on men like those in the 1511th, making sure supplies reached the right place at the right time. It was vital work. It was also work that the U.S. military had decided black men were suited for, because the military had also decided that black men weren't suited for combat. Nearly every enlisted man in the unit was black. All but one of the officers were white. This wasn't unusual. The United States Armed Forces were strictly segregated in 1943. The official policy, inherited from a military tradition stretching back to the aftermath of the Civil War, held that black and white troops should serve in separate units under separate commands. But segregation went deeper than just unit assignment. Black troops faced discrimination at every level. They were typically assigned to service roles rather than combat positions. They received inferior equipment and facilities. When they stopped at bases run by white troops, they were often forced to sleep in their vehicles because they weren't allowed in the barracks. The food they received was frequently worse than what white troops got, and they were subject to a level of scrutiny and discipline that white soldiers rarely experienced. Military commanders treated service units like the 1511th as dumping grounds for their least competent officers. If you were a white officer who'd failed at other assignments, if you'd shown poor judgment or leadership, you might end up commanding a black unit. The assumption was that it didn't matter, because the men under your command didn't matter as much. The soldiers knew this. They lived with it every single day. Also stationed in Bamber Bridge was the 234th Military Police Company. All white, all tasked with maintaining order and discipline among American troops in the area. All carrying the same assumptions about race that the regular army did, but with the added authority to enforce those assumptions with arrests, with violence if necessary, with whatever it took to keep black soldiers in their place. What happened when these two units occupied the same small English village would become known as the Battle of Bamber Bridge. But to understand why this confrontation was inevitable, you need to understand what those black soldiers found when they arrived in England, and how profoundly it contradicted everything they'd been taught about their place in the world. Imagine you're a black soldier from Georgia or Alabama or Mississippi. You've spent your entire life under a system designed to remind you every single day that you're not equal. You can't drink from the same water fountains. You can't eat at the same lunch counters. You can't sit where you want on a bus. You can't vote without facing threats and violence. You can't look a white person in the eye without risking consequences. You definitely can't socialize with white women without risking your life. These aren't just customs. They're laws. Jim Crow laws, backed by police, by courts, by the full power of state governments. Break them, and you learn very quickly what happens to black people who step out of line. Then the war comes. Your country drafts you. Suddenly you're good enough to wear the uniform, good enough to serve, good enough to die if necessary. But you're not good enough to train with white soldiers. Not good enough to fight alongside them. Not good enough to be treated as their equal. You cross the Atlantic. You arrive in England, and something impossible happens. For men who had grown up under Jim Crow in America, Bamber Bridge must have felt like stepping into another world. Like waking up from a nightmare and discovering that the nightmare was only happening in one place, that the rest of the world didn't work that way at all. The pubs welcomed them. Not with reluctance, not with conditions, not with separate sections. They welcomed them the same way they welcomed anyone else. The locals invited them to dances, taught them English dances, learned American dances from them. British soldiers drank alongside them without a second thought, without any of the careful distance that white American soldiers maintained. Young women chatted with them on the street, laughed at their jokes, accepted invitations to dance. There were no separate water fountains, because the concept of separate water fountains didn't exist here. No back entrances for colored patrons, no signs telling them where they could and couldn't go, no system of unspoken rules that you violated at your peril. For the first time in their lives, these men could walk into a pub and not wonder if they'd be served, could talk to a woman without checking over their shoulder, could exist in public space without the constant, exhausting vigilance that every black person in America had to maintain. It wasn't perfect. Britain had its own history with race, its own prejudices about people from the colonies, but day-to-day life in a Lancashire village in 1943 didn't include the systemized, legally enforced racial segregation that defined the American South. The British might have been surprised to meet black Americans, but they weren't horrified. They weren't outraged. They were curious, friendly, welcoming. George Orwell, writing in his newspaper column, As I Please, in December 1943, noted that among the British population, the general consensus of opinion seems to be that the only American soldiers with decent manners are the Negroes. A West Country farmer put it more bluntly. I love the Americans, but I don't like those white ones that they have brought with them. Cleo the Hathcock, a black GI stationed in Britain, remembered it this way. At that time the jitterbug was in, and the blacks would get a buggin', and the English just loved that. We would go into a dance hall and just take over the place because everybody wanted to learn how to do that American dance, the jitterbug. They went wild over that. The American military command was horrified. They hadn't crossed the Atlantic to fight fascism, only to watch their carefully maintained system of racial segregation crumble in English pubs and dance halls. According to author Anthony Burgess, who taught in Bamber Bridge after the war, U.S. commanders demanded that the village's 3 pubs impose a color bar. The pub landlord's response? They put up signs reading, "Black troops only." If that story is true, and historians have debated it, it reveals something crucial about the atmosphere in Bamber Bridge in the spring of 1943. The villagers had chosen a side, and it wasn't the side their American allies expected. The white American officers and military police couldn't understand it. To them, the natural order of things was being violated. They'd brought their army to England to fight Germans, and they expected to maintain their way of doing things while they were here. That included keeping black soldiers separate from white civilians. It included maintaining the hierarchy that everyone back home understood and accepted. But the British civilians of Bamber Bridge weren't playing along, and that made everything more volatile. There was another factor making an already tense situation explosive, an event that happened thousands of miles away, but sent shockwaves through every black unit in the U.S. military. Just 4 days before the incident in Bamber Bridge, race riots had torn through Detroit, Michigan, the city that built the tanks and bombers that were supposed to win the war, the arsenal of democracy, as President Roosevelt had called it. It started on June 20th at Belle Isle, Detroit's large park in the middle of the Detroit River. The exact spark is lost to conflicting accounts, but by evening, fights had broken out between white and black residents. Then came the rumors, spreading like fire through a city already tinder dry with racial tension. In black neighborhoods, people heard that white mobs had thrown a black woman and her baby off the Belle Isle Bridge. In white neighborhoods, people heard that black men had attacked and raped white women. Neither rumor was true, but truth didn't matter. The city exploded. Mobs of white people attacked black people on the streets, on streetcars, in their neighborhoods. The police, overwhelmingly white, responded by attacking black people too. They shot into black neighborhoods. They arrested black people for defending themselves. They stood by while white rioters overturned cars and smashed windows. The violence raged for 3 days. From June 20th to June 22nd, the arsenal of democracy was a war zone. When President Franklin Roosevelt finally sent in 6,000 federal troops to restore order. When the smoke cleared and the bodies were counted, 34 people were dead. 25 of them were black. 17 of those were killed by the Detroit Police Department. Another 433 people were wounded. 75% of them were black. 1,700 people were arrested. 85% of them were black. The mathematics told the real story. This wasn't a race riot in the sense of 2 groups fighting each other. This was a pogrom. This was white mobs, backed by white police, attacking black neighborhoods while the authorities either participated or looked the other way. And it happened in the North, in a major city, in a place that was supposed to be better than the South, more progressive, more enlightened. If this could happen in Detroit, what couldn't happen? News of Detroit reached the black troops in Britain. There were no smartphones, no internet, no 24-hour news cycle, but the story spread through letters from home, through radio broadcasts, through the military grapevine. Every black soldier stationed overseas learned what had happened. They knew that while they wore the uniform and prepared to fight for democracy in Europe, black Americans were being beaten and shot in American streets by American police. They knew that if they survived the war and went home, they'd be going home to that. The men of the 15th 11th weren't naive about their situation. They understood that the freedom they were experiencing in England was temporary, conditional, fragile. They knew that white American military police were watching them, looking for any excuse to reassert control, to remind them that democracy had limits, and those limits were drawn in color. They'd faced harassment from white military police before. This wasn't hypothetical. It was daily reality. At bases run by white troops, they received poor food and often had to sleep in their trucks because they weren't allowed in the barracks. MPs hassled them for minor uniform infractions that would be ignored for white soldiers. The black troops complained about it, but nothing changed. The system protected itself. So when that warm evening in late June arrived, when soldiers from the 1511th headed into Bamber Bridge for a few hours of freedom, they carried that weight with them, the memory of Detroit, the knowledge of what was waiting for them back home, the understanding that this moment of equality in an English village was an aberration, not the norm. They carried it, but for a few hours they tried to forget it. They laughed with the locals. They danced. They drank. They were just young men, far from home, trying to enjoy an evening before the war called them back. And then the military police arrived. The evening of June 24th, 1943, started like many others in Bamber Bridge. Some soldiers from the 1511 Tier were drinking at Ye Olde Hob Inn, the village's thatched roof pub on Church Road, mixing with locals as closing time approached. The pub was warm, crowded, full of conversation and laughter. British accents mixed with American ones. Someone was telling a story. Someone else was trying to order one more round before last call. Around 10 p.m., word reached the military police station that there were black soldiers at Ye Olde Hob Inn who weren't in proper uniform. 3 white American soldiers, passing by the pub, had seen them and reported it to the MPs. Whether those white soldiers were concerned about military discipline or just irritated to see black men socializing freely with white British civilians, we'll never know. 2 military police officers, Corporal Roy Windsor and Private First Class Ralph Ridgway, drove to the pub to investigate. These weren't bad men, necessarily. They were soldiers doing their job, enforcing the regulations they'd been told to enforce. But they were also white men from an America that had taught them very specific things about black people and about what happened when black people stepped out of line. Inside the pub, Windsor and Ridgway found Private Eugene Nunn. Nunn had just returned from a long drive to Manchester, delivering supplies to another base. He was tired. He'd stopped for a drink before heading back to camp. He was still wearing his field jacket instead of the required Class A uniform, the dress uniform that soldiers were supposed to wear when off-duty in town. It was a minor infraction, the kind of thing that would normally get a warning, maybe a mild reprimand, the kind of thing that white soldiers did all the time without consequence. But Nunn wasn't white. The MPs asked him to step outside. Nunn, who'd just experienced several hours of being treated like a normal human being by the British people around him, who'd been laughing and drinking, and forgetting for a moment what life was like back in America, didn't move quickly enough. Or maybe he questioned why he was being singled out. Or maybe he just wanted to finish his drink. Whatever the reason, an argument erupted. The noise brought people from all over the pub. Local people pressed in to see what was happening. British soldiers stood up from their tables. Everyone wanted to know what the problem was, why these American MPs were making a scene, why they were bothering a soldier who'd been sitting quietly, causing no trouble. One British soldier, his sense of fairness offended by what he was seeing, challenged the MPs directly. "Why do you want to arrest them? They're not doing anything or bothering anybody." The crowd's sympathy was obvious. They were on Nunn's side, and that made the situation more volatile because the MPs weren't just dealing with one black soldier now. They were dealing with a crowd of British civilians who didn't understand or accept American racial hierarchy. Private Lynn Adams, another black soldier, advanced on Corporal Windsor with a bottle. Windsor drew his gun. The situation was seconds from turning lethal when Staff Sergeant William Byrd, who was black, managed to defuse the confrontation. Windsor put his gun away. The 2 MPs pushed through the crowd and climbed back into their jeep. "We'll be back," they shouted as they drove off. Adams threw his beer bottle at the vehicle. It shattered on the windscreen. The black soldiers walked away from the pub, conferring among themselves. They knew this wasn't over. Whatever was about to happen had been building for months. The MPs returned to their station and picked up 2 reinforcements. Then they contacted their superior officers, Captain Julius Hurst and Lieutenant Gerald Windsor. The officers' orders were simple: do your duty. Arrest those black soldiers. As the soldiers from the 1511th walked back toward their base on Station Road, the MPs intercepted them. A fight broke out. In the chaos and darkness of the Lancashire evening, one of the MPs opened fire. Private William Crossland, 25 years old, a former railroad worker from Virginia, was struck in the back. The bullet entered near his heart. He died shortly after. Some of the injured black soldiers made it back to Adams Hall. Others scattered into the night, not sure where to go, knowing only that a white MP had just taken fire, and that meant there would be consequences. But Crossland's death changed everything. It transformed what had been a street fight into something far more serious. It crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. As word spread through the base, panic took hold. Soldiers gathered in groups, their voices rising. Someone said Crossland was dead. Someone else said more MPs were coming. The rumors multiplied and morphed with each retelling until nobody knew what was true anymore, except this: a black soldier had been shot, and the men who shot him were white military police. Between 150 and 200 soldiers milled around the base, anger and fear mixing into something dangerous. Some wanted revenge. Some wanted protection. Some just wanted to understand what had happened and what would happen next. The rumor that spread fastest, the one that gained the most traction, was simple and terrifying. The MPs were coming back to shoot more black soldiers. It wasn't an unreasonable fear. These men had just learned about Detroit, where 17 black men had been shot dead by police in 3 days. Now, in a foreign country, miles from home, one of their own had been shot in the back by a white MP. If it happened once, why wouldn't it happen again? The camp's commanding officer, Major George Harris, rushed to restore order. He stood before the angry crowd and tried to appeal to discipline, to order, to trust in the system. But the soldiers ignored him. They'd trusted the system their whole lives, and the system had taught them very clearly that their lives didn't matter as much as white lives. Major Harris was a white officer. Why would they trust him now, when one of them was dead? The situation was spiraling beyond his control, and Harris knew it. So he turned to the one officer who might be able to reach these men, the unit's only black officer, Second Lieutenant Edwin Jones. Jones was in an impossible position. He wore the same uniform as Harris, held the same commission, served the same military. But he also lived the same life as the enlisted men, faced the same discrimination, knew the same fear. He was an officer, but he was also black in an America that had very clear ideas about what that meant. Jones stepped forward and addressed the men. His message was careful, balanced between understanding and discipline. "Let's go back to barracks," he told them. "The guilty ones will suffer. We'll see that justice is done." It was a promise he might not be able to keep, and the men probably knew it. But Jones was one of them in a way that Harris never could be. His words carried weight. The soldiers began to calm down. Some went back to their quarters. The tight knots of angry men began to disperse. It seemed like Jones and Harris had managed to contain the crisis, to prevent it from escalating into something worse. Major Harris allowed himself to believe that the situation was under control. Yes, one soldier was dead. Yes, there would be an investigation, probably courts-martial, but at least they'd avoided a full-scale mutiny. At least the men were going back to their quarters. At least. Then, around midnight, the roar of engines shattered the uneasy quiet. Multiple jeeps pulled into Adams Hall, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Inside were more than 20 military police, armed and ready. One vehicle was an improvised armored car with a machine gun mounted on top, the kind of weapon you'd use to suppress a serious threat, the kind of weapon you'd use if you expected to face heavy resistance. The headlights swept across the base, illuminating the black soldiers standing in the yard, catching them in harsh white light like criminals in a prison break. The machine gun on that armored car was pointed directly at them. To the men of the 15th 11th, this was the confirmation of their worst fears. The MPs hadn't come to investigate. They hadn't come to arrest a few troublemakers. They'd come in force, with overwhelming firepower, looking like they were ready for war, looking like they'd come to kill. The rumor had been true. The MPs were here to finish what they'd started on Station Road. What happened next occurred in seconds, driven by panic and fear and the absolutely reasonable belief that these black soldiers were about to be shot down in their own camp by their own military police. The soldiers broke for the base armory. Someone got the door open. Within minutes, they'd armed themselves with rifles. 2/3 of the weapons in the camp were taken, passed from hand to hand, loaded with shaking fingers. Men who'd been trying to calm down, who'd been listening to Lieutenant Jones's promise that justice would be done, now grabbed weapons because justice with a machine gun pointed at you looked very different than justice in a courtroom. The MPs, seeing armed black soldiers, made a quick decision. They retreated from the base, engines roaring as they backed out and sped away. But they didn't go far. They positioned themselves in the town, setting up defensive positions, preparing for what they now believed was a full-scale mutiny. The soldiers of the 1511th didn't stay on base. Some of them, fueled by rage at Crossland's death, followed the MPs into town. Others went looking for the MPs who'd shot their friend, wanting answers, wanting revenge, wanting something other than the helpless fury of watching a comrade die for no reason. What happened over the next 4 hours depends on whose account you read. American military records describe marauding parties of black soldiers patrolling the streets and shooting sporadically, painting a picture of chaos and violence. British civilians remembered it differently. They recalled armed soldiers knocking on doors, warning families to stay inside, to keep away from the windows, to stay safe. They remembered men who seemed more concerned with protecting civilians than attacking them. The truth was probably some combination of both. There were likely soldiers who wanted blood. There were certainly soldiers who just wanted to survive the night. There were probably soldiers who didn't know what they wanted, except to not be shot down like William Crossland had been shot down. British police attempted to set up a roadblock. Gunfire was reported from multiple locations across Bamber Bridge. The darkness made everything worse, made it impossible to know who was shooting at whom, whether that sound was a rifle or a car backfiring, whether that shadow was a soldier or a civilian. The firefight lasted until around 4 a.m. on June 25th. Gradually, as exhaustion set in, as ammunition ran low, as the adrenaline faded and cold reality set in, the shooting stopped. Men returned to base. The MPs pulled back. An eerie quiet settled over Bamber Bridge. When dawn finally came, when the sun rose over Lancashire and illuminated the scene, the full scope of the violence became clear. One man was dead. Private William Crossland, 25 years old, shot in the back while walking home from a pub. 7 others were wounded, 5 black soldiers and 2 military police. Bullet holes marked the walls of buildings throughout the village. Shell casings littered the streets. Bamber Bridge looked like it had been through a battle, which in a sense it had. But this wasn't a battle between armies. This was a battle between soldiers who should have been on the same side, who wore the same uniform, who were supposedly fighting for the same cause. This was the ugly reality of American racial segregation played out on foreign soil, where people could see it clearly, where the contradictions couldn't be hidden. The US military moved quickly to contain the fallout. Orders went out immediately. This incident was classified. The press was not to know the location. They were not to know the racial dimensions. They were not to know anything except that violence had occurred somewhere in northwest England. All newspapers, both British and American, were told only that violence had occurred somewhere in northwest England. The location was censored. The racial element was carefully omitted. The American public would not learn what had really happened in Bamber Bridge. The British public wouldn't get the full story either. The military couldn't have people asking uncomfortable questions about why American soldiers were shooting at each other, why black troops had felt threatened enough to raid an armory, why one soldier was dead over a uniform violation. The censorship worked. For decades, this story remained almost unknown outside of Bamber Bridge itself. The military had successfully buried one of the most significant racial confrontations of the entire war. But the military couldn't suppress the internal reckoning that followed, because General Ira Eaker refused to let them. 2 separate courts-martial were convened. The US military was determined to send a message, to reassert control, to make clear that what happened in Bamber Bridge would not be tolerated. They were going to prosecute these black soldiers with the full weight of military justice. The first trial, in August, dealt with the 4 black soldiers involved in the initial confrontation at the pub. These were the men who'd argued with the MPs, who'd refused to comply, who'd set this whole chain of events in motion. 3 were sentenced to 3 to 4 years of hard labor and dishonorable discharges. The 4th received 2.5 years of hard labor. The second trial was larger, more sweeping. It concluded on September 18th and involved 35 defendants. These were the men who'd broken into the armory, who'd armed themselves, who'd followed the MPs into town, who'd fired weapons during the confrontation. The charges were serious: mutiny, seizing arms, rioting, opening fire on officers and MPs. This was the kind of thing that could get you executed in wartime. 7 were acquitted, 28 were convicted. Sentences ranged from 3 months to 15 years, with 7 soldiers receiving sentences of 12 years or more. Some of these men faced the prospect of spending the rest of their youth, possibly the rest of their lives, in military prison. And throughout both trials, one fact stood out in its absence. Not one white military police officer was charged with anything. Not the MP who shot William Crossland in the back. Not the officers who ordered the MPs to make arrests. Not the MPs who showed up at Adams Hall with a machine gun. Nobody on the white side faced any consequences whatsoever. The message was clear. Black soldiers who fought back would be punished. White MPs who escalated situations, who used lethal force, who showed up with overwhelming firepower, would walk away free. It looked like business as usual. It looked like the military had successfully reinforced the racial order, punished the troublemakers, and moved on. But something unexpected happened during these trials. As testimony was heard, as witnesses were questioned, as the full story came out, a pattern emerged that some officers found disturbing. The testimony revealed a systematic pattern of racist abuse by the MPs. The court-martial records, preserved in the National Archives, spent more time discussing the beer covering the military police after Adams threw the bottle than they did examining how Crossland died. They focused on the disrespect shown to the MPs, the failure to follow orders, the breakdown of discipline. They barely mentioned that a man had been shot in the back for a uniform violation. General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, read the reports and reached a conclusion that many white officers found uncomfortable. As one account put it, Eaker realized that 90% of the trouble in these racial incidents was the fault of white officers and MPs. Eaker's response was decisive. He combined all the black trucking units, including the 1,511th, into a single special command. Then he purged the ranks of that command, removing inexperienced and racist officers. Most significantly, he integrated the MP patrols, putting black and white military police together on duty. It was a radical step for 1943, and it worked. Morale among black troops stationed in England improved. The rate of courts-martial fell. Although there were several more racial incidents between black and white American troops in Britain, none reached the scale of Bamber Bridge. The sentences from the courts-martial were eventually reduced on appeal. The poor leadership and the racist slurs used by MPs were considered mitigating factors. Most of the convicted soldiers were back on duty within a year. But for William Crossland, there was no appeal, no second chance. His military records list his death as DNB, died non-battle. The official record states he experienced a critical situation which resulted in loss of life. He was posthumously found guilty of riotous behavior, resisting arrest, and assaulting military police. His family back in Virginia wasn't told the full circumstances of his death for decades. The story of Bamber Bridge remained largely unknown outside the village itself until the late 1980s. That's when Clinton Smith, a black maintenance worker, noticed what he thought was termite damage in the wooden facade of the NatWest Bank in Bamber Bridge. I flippantly said to my colleagues, "You've got big termites," Smith recalled, and they looked at me with complete dismay and said, "No, they're not termite holes, lad. They're bullet holes." Smith spent the next 40 years researching and promoting the story of what happened in his village. In 2013, the University of Central Lancashire held a symposium to mark the 70th anniversary. In 2022, a memorial garden was created opposite Ye Olde Hob Inn, the pub where it all started. The Battle of Bamber Bridge wasn't just about one night of violence. It was about a clash between two visions of what it meant to fight for freedom. The American military brought Jim Crow to England and expected the British to enforce it. The people of Bamber Bridge refused, and that refusal mattered more than they could have known at the time. In Britain, there were 44 reported clashes between black and white American troops just between November 1943 and February 1944. Violence erupted in Bristol, where 400 black GIs fought with 120 white MPs in what became known as the Park Street Riot. It happened in Launceston, Cornwall, where 14 black soldiers were charged with mutiny and attempted murder after confronting MPs about being banned from town pubs. It happened in Kingsclear, Hampshire, where 3 people died in a confrontation eerily similar to Bamber Bridge. Towns across England became battlegrounds in America's racial war. But Bamber Bridge was different. Bamber Bridge was different because of how completely, how unreservedly, The local population sided with the black soldiers. In other places, British civilians might have been sympathetic or neutral. In Bamber Bridge, they actively intervened. When Gillian Vesey worked as a young barmaid at Ye Olde Hob Inn, she didn't just serve black soldiers politely. She stood up to white American soldiers who expected to be served before black troops, insisting they wait their turn like everyone else. She made it clear. In her pub, everyone was equal. That's not nothing. That's not a small gesture. That's a young woman, probably in her 20s, probably earning barely enough to get by, standing up to armed foreign soldiers and telling them that their racism wasn't welcome here. That takes courage. That takes conviction. That takes a belief in human equality strong enough to risk consequences. And she wasn't alone. The whole village made that choice. They could have stayed neutral. They could have shrugged and said this was an American problem. Let the Americans sort it out. They could have followed the military's instructions and helped enforce segregation in their pubs and shops. It would have been easier. It would have avoided conflict. It would have meant less trouble. They did the opposite. They put up signs reading, "Black troops only," if that's what it took to make clear where they stood. They defended black soldiers from military police. They testified on their behalf in court. And decades later, when the story had been forgotten everywhere else, they kept telling it. They kept remembering. In 2013, the University of Central Lancashire held a symposium to mark the 70th anniversary. They screened a documentary called Chocolate Soldiers from the USA. They staged a play about the incident. They made sure that a new generation learned what had happened in their village. In 2022, they created a memorial garden opposite Ye Olde Hob Inn, the pub where it all started. A place to remember. A place to reflect on what happened when ordinary people were forced to choose between complicity and courage. The villagers of Bamber Bridge chose courage, and 80 years later, they're still choosing to remember, still honoring the men who came to their village from across the Atlantic and found, for a brief moment, what freedom felt like. 5 years after Bamber Bridge, on July 26, 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the U.S. Armed Forces. The order stated that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. It was a landmark moment. It didn't end racism in the military overnight, but it began the process. And while Bamber Bridge wasn't the only factor that led to that order, it was part of a pattern that military leadership could no longer ignore. You couldn't have incidents like this happening in multiple British towns. Couldn't have black soldiers arming themselves against military police. Couldn't have foreign civilians testifying about racist abuse and just pretend everything was fine. Something had to change. General Eaker had proven that change was possible. His reforms in the 8th Air Force showed that integrating MP patrols worked, that removing racist officers improved morale, that treating black soldiers with basic dignity made them more effective, not less. The military learned, slowly and painfully, what the villagers of Bamber Bridge had understood immediately. Treating people as equals wasn't just morally right. It was practically necessary if you wanted a functional fighting force, but the men of the 15th 11th didn't get to see much of that progress. They returned to an America that was still segregated, still hostile, still dangerous for black people who demanded equality. Some black veterans were attacked for wearing their uniforms in public. Some were denied service in restaurants that welcomed German prisoners of war. Some were lynched, murdered by mobs who couldn't tolerate the idea of black men who'd been treated as equals in Europe, coming home and expecting the same treatment in America. The freedom they'd experienced in Britain made those injustices even harder to bear, because now they knew. Now they'd lived in a place where their uniform mattered more than their skin color. Now they'd been welcomed into pubs and homes and dances. Now they'd been treated as human beings. You can't unknow that. You can't go back to accepting segregation once you've experienced equality. The men who served in Britain came home changed. They weren't willing to sit at the back of the bus anymore. They weren't willing to accept separate water fountains. They weren't willing to pretend that Jim Crow was acceptable just because it was legal. Many of them became part of the civil rights movement. They'd fought for democracy overseas. Now they were going to fight for it at home. They'd learned in places like Bamber Bridge that another way was possible. Now they were going to make that possibility real in America. That's the legacy of Bamber Bridge. Not just the violence of one June night, but the vision of what could be. A vision of a world where a black soldier could walk into a pub and be welcomed, where civilians would stand up to authority to defend what was right, where people chose equality over comfort, courage over compliance. William Crossland died in Bamber Bridge on June 24, 1943. He was 25 years old. He'd worked on the railroad before the war. He'd driven trucks across England, delivering the supplies that kept the air war against Germany running. He'd laughed with locals in an English pub, experiencing a freedom he'd never known in Virginia. The army said he died in a non-battle situation, as if that somehow made it less tragic, less significant. But the truth is that William Crossland died fighting for the same thing those black soldiers were always fighting for, whether in England or America, whether in uniform or out. The right to be treated as human beings, the right to exist in public space without fear, the right to drink a beer in a pub without being shot in the back for wearing the wrong jacket. That's a battle that was far from over in 1943. In many ways, it's still not over today. The specific forms change, the laws change, the language changes, but the fundamental struggle, the question of whether black lives matter as much as white lives, whether black humanity will be recognized and protected, that struggle continues. But the people of Bamber Bridge showed us something important. They showed us that when that battle comes to your doorstep, when you're forced to choose between the comfortable lie and the difficult truth, some people will always choose to stand on the right side. They'll put up those signs. They'll defend those soldiers. They'll testify in those courtrooms. They'll create those memorials. They'll tell those stories to their children and grandchildren, making sure the memory doesn't fade, making sure the lesson isn't lost. Even 80 years later, Bamber Bridge remembers. The bullet holes in the old bank building have been preserved. The memorial garden stands across from Ye Olde Hob Inn. The story is taught in schools. When people ask what it means to be an ally, what it means to stand up for justice when it's difficult, when it costs you something, the answer is right there in a small Lancashire village. It means you refuse to enforce someone else's racism, even when they're powerful, even when they're your allies. It means you welcome people into your community based on their character, not their color. It means you stand up when you see injustice, even if it's not your fight, even if it would be easier to look away. It means you remember the names: William Crossland, Eugene Nunn, Edwin Jones, the men of the 15th 11th Quartermaster Truck Regiment, the soldiers who found freedom in an English village and fought to keep it, even for just one more night. That's what Bamber Bridge did. That's what they're still doing. And that's a legacy worth honoring, worth remembering, worth learning from. 80 years later, and for as long as the story of democracy and justice continues to be written,